Great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the NASEO webinar on fostering economic diversification in coal communities. My name is Kelsey Jones, and I'm a senior program manager with the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO. And this webinar will really be an opportunity to hear from three experts working to provide both economic development and workforce opportunities to local communities across the country. We'll hear from the speakers and finish up with some Q&A open discussion. So please prepare to put any questions into the Q&A box and we'll get those addressed after the presentations. And just a few quick logistics. As all of you can see, this is a Zoom webinar, so only the speakers will be on screen. Please feel free to send myself or my colleague, Catherine Reed, a message on Zoom or an email if you're having any technical issues, and we'll be happy to help out. We will be sharing the slides and recording after the webinar, so please feel free to continue to use this as a resource going forward. And finally, I wanted to thank the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management for their support of this effort. This is the second webinar NASEO has hosted on just transition efforts over the last year, and we're going to be using some of the information and resources shared on this webinar and the previous one to contribute to a just transition framework that we'll be releasing later this summer. That's meant to be as a resource and guide for states. So really looking forward to the presentations today. And if you want to go to the next slide, Catherine. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our three speakers today. First up, we'll have Briggs White, Deputy Executive Director with the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization, followed by Amanda Ormond, the Co-Director of the Just Energy Transition Center with Arizona State University, followed by Michael Skiffington, Director of Reliability and Environmental Stewardship with the Virginia Department of Energy. So I'll turn it over to Briggs to kick us off.
Well, thank you, Kelsey. And it's nice to be with everybody here to talk a little bit about energy transition. And I'm happy to share some updates on the Federal Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities and Economic Revitalization, or Energy Communities, IWG for short. Let's go to the next slide. Just to sort of put us in context, the energy transition is certainly having some impacts in terms of closures in the coal sector. Here you have a map of coal mines and coal plants over the last 40 years or so. And additionally, I should point out that while transition hasn't hit the oil and gas sector all that much, there are some places like California where state policy is driving some closures and dislocations, particularly around refineries. And so, there's when every one of these facilities closes, it has an impact on the workers that potentially lose their jobs or have to get retrained. And those are, good paying jobs with pretty high levels of benefits, so difficult to replace, as well as a big impact on the tax base, particularly when the economies are not particularly diversified. And so as we think about sort of what do these communities need, it's resolution of that tax base loss through additional economic development activity, it's assistance for the workers to help them get to their next job opportunity. And that requires a wide variety of things. Let's go to the next slide. So last summer, we issued a request for information to specifically try to understand better from stakeholders sort of what they need. Going back 2 years ago when we were writing an initial report to the president, we also held some listening sessions, and since then have done either place-based events in the field or webinars where we've interacted with nearly 10,000 people at this point, 2.5 years in. And some of the top needs that bubble up are on the screen. No two communities are the same, but in general, these communities tend to be rural and isolated, which makes economic development challenging. Although not always. You could point to, for example, coal plants in downriver Detroit as an example of an urban environment. But nevertheless, tend to be capacity constrained, and hence community capacity building and technical assistance is sort of a linchpin for them taking advantage of the state and federal resources that are available to help them through the transition. A lot of these facilities, when they're shut down, need to be remediated, or those assets can be built off of for redevelopment. And so, one opportunity for economic development is leveraging resources to take advantage, for example, with coal plants of the interconnection infrastructure that allows potentially new generation to go in, or perhaps a manufacturing facility. And so a lot of support in terms of brownfields remediation, or in the mines case of abandoned mine land remediation out of the Department of Interior available to help out with that part. A lot of funds thanks to the infrastructure bill for basic infrastructure. And again, back when that request for information we issued, basic infrastructure was one of our top cited priorities from communities. And if you look at the funding that EDA handed out as part of their American Recovery Plan, a good bit of it went to things like sewer and water. And so a lot of these places still lack the basic infrastructure they need in order to be competitive for economic development. Of course, the workers need help. And so displaced worker benefits, training, et cetera, are critical, and the states have a really important role to play there. But also getting a workforce that's ready for the next economic development driver that's going to come in. And that leads me to housing, which is the workers have to live someplace. And as we've been hearing about workers and aligning them with the next economic driver in these places, housing comes up as an issue. Did want to flag that there are some low-income programs, and while not every energy community is a low-income community, there certainly are some persistent poverty communities that can take advantage of those federal resources. And then healthcare comes up, whether it's black lung for coal miners, or in some parts of the country, unfortunately, substance use disorder and that kind of thing. So just wanted to provide a sense of sort of what were some of the top needs that we're hearing. But the good news is there is quite a bit of resources on the table, but we need to make sure that we're making those as available as possible. Let's go to the next slide. And so in the first week of the president's administration, he signed Executive Order 14008, which established this working group that I'm speaking of. In the first couple of months, we wrote an initial report which identified $38 billion of funding that was available, not necessarily guaranteed to energy communities, but was available for them to compete for or access through formula funds. And then we've issued now 2 reports, that initial report, and then we issued a second-year report, which provides accomplishments since then, as well as a look forward back in April. And you can get both of those reports on our website, which is energycommunities.gov. We bring a whole of government approach to this because there is such a wide variety of needs. And so we have 11 federal agencies plus various White House offices involved. Next slide. So a huge amount of funding available. It comes in a couple of different flavors. There is around $500 billion worth of competitive funding available. Again, back to that lack of capacity, a real challenge there in terms of making that funding actually land in the communities that most need it. And that's one real key priority for us. But nevertheless, $500 billion of funding out there to go after through grant writing and the like in a competitive environment. Another $500 billion in formula funding. So that primarily goes to the states, but also tribal nations and other intermediaries. And then the communities can access that through the states or other intermediaries. And that doesn't count 22 IRA-sponsored tax credits, a lot of them in the clean energy space. And so, in fact, just today, there was an update on a 10% bonus tax credit specifically for energy communities that impacts both the investment tax credit and a production tax credit for clean energy. So a lot of important activity in that space. Did want to flag that, one thing we hear all the time is that cost share is really tough for a lot of energy communities to come up with. And so at energycommunities.gov, you can access a sortable database of all of these funds that we've curated. In particular, you can sort on whether or not there are cost share requirements. So hopefully that's helpful. Next slide. Just a couple of quick updates on IRA. One on the far left, the loan program office out of DOE issued Title 17 guidance a few weeks ago. That includes specifically a new program that was authorized by IRA that provides LPO with the ability to authorize up to $250 billion worth of loan guarantees, specifically around reinvesting in energy infrastructure assets. So a great opportunity to take, let's say, a coal mine that's or a coal plant that's already shut down and invest in that. You can include remediation in the loan guarantee. You can also think more flexibly than just coal assets. There's pipelines, there's refineries. So lots of opportunity in fossil communities with that new provision. I mentioned the tax credits. There's tax credits for manufacturing. And in particular, there's a $10 billion tax credit called 48C for clean energy manufacturing with a $4 billion carve out for coal communities. The eligibility map and final guidance went live on that about a week and a half ago. And then I mentioned the bonus tax credits already with an update earlier today. I do want to flag over in the right-hand side, EPA is managing a new greenhouse gas reduction fund. It has 3 tranches, which make up the $27 billion, including a focus on disadvantaged and low-income communities, as well as some aspects on solar. So that currently is being proposed in terms of a framework and is open for comment. And that competition will ensue after comments are received. Also in the environmental justice space, $3 billion worth of funding, including importantly some additional resources in terms of technical assistance centers that will go out. So a lot of important help for communities to access, yes, environmental justice, but also more broadly federal resources. Let's go to the next slide. I just wanted to share one example of a tool that we have on energycommunities.gov, seeing the interest from the private sector, particularly around the tax credits and the LPO provisions. We've created a tool for visualizing opportunities to repurpose coal power plants. And so just one example of an informational resource that can be helpful and accessed on the website as more and more interest in investing in these energy communities happens. Next slide. And recognizing that it is a challenge for low capacity communities to uptake these resources, we are building out a network of what we're calling rapid response teams. So these are on the ground staff that are prioritizing energy communities and working in a way that's coordinated across 11 agencies in these various parts of the country that are shown. We've established 4 in Wyoming, the Four Corners, the Illinois Coal Basin, and Eastern Kentucky, and are rapidly building out the network to include a few more. We recently had an MOU signed by 11 federal agencies that are partnering on this, which really shows the commitment at the leadership level. Many were signed at the deputy secretary level or other senior level. So some significant commitment and staff on the ground listening to communities and helping them align resources with the projects that they want to go after. This is really an effort to be community driven, not top down from the federal government. Next slide. And states are really important. And so I just wanted to share, as we've been doing these rapid response teams, we've been having some really good collaboration with states. And also states are doing some innovative work in the energy transition space, frequently with leadership out of the executive branch and with legislation being passed. Just a few examples of how they're doing it. In Kentucky, recently HB 9 was passed, which provides a pool of cost share funds specifically for coal communities to go after federal resources. On the right-hand side, you see Minnesota, Illinois, New Mexico, and Colorado with different ways to achieve the objective, but nevertheless all having some level of centralized coordination, specifically dedicated to energy communities, as well as aligned funding on energy communities. In West Virginia, there are resources through universities to provide for grant writing capacity, and centralized coordination in Wyoming and Pennsylvania, specifically in collaboration with our rapid response teams there. So some really healthy engagement in terms of states and federal officials working together to drive resources into energy communities. So just a few things going on around the country. And next slide. So as I wrap up, I just wanted to share a few opportunities for getting involved. You know, the first thing is that there's a ton of opportunity on the table for energy communities, and would love to work with states in terms of sort of highlighting that to investors, as well as coordinating those investment opportunities. Where we have the rapid response teams, again, we found states to be incredibly helpful. Recognize half of the funding in our clearinghouse is running through the states as intermediaries, and we want to take a really coordinated approach to that. But also, you may have a network and are hearing from communities and would love to partner up. And then finally, as I shared in the last slide, you know, states are providing some really complementary resources that, frankly, the federal government, by statute, in most cases, cannot provide. Usually, it's prohibited for federal resources to be used for grant writing to access federal resources, for example. And sometimes, unfortunately, we cannot waive cost sharing requirements per statute. So states can play a really important role that can unlock some of those federal resources so they can land in their states. Let's go to the last slide. And so just with that, I'd say, you know, thank you. And please do feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk more about how we can connect. And you can see on the bottom left, you know, we're on social media, et cetera, and feel free to sign up for our newsletter and so on. And love to get you all involved in more work that we're doing together. And that's the end of my talk.
Thanks so much, Briggs. That was a great presentation. I'll turn things over to Amanda.
Great, thanks so much. Appreciate going after Briggs. I always learn things when I come to your webinars, so I appreciate that. I've got a couple questions for you. Amanda Ormond, I'm a professor of practice at Arizona State University, and I'm the co-director of the Just Energy Transition Center at Arizona State University that was created about 2019. First slide, please. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the center, talk about what we're working on, and then close with some lessons learned. So why do we have a jet center? Because coal plants are closing. We had 5 coal plants in the state. Navajo Generating Station on the Navajo Nation closed in 2019. We have 4 left. 3 are in northern Arizona. The economic fallout for the northern Arizona region and the one in southern Arizona is going to be significant, as you all know. So the university said there's nobody really working in this space. We should get into this space. Next, please. So what did we want to do in this center? We wanted to understand the impacts on the community, on the state, on the region. We wanted to help the communities think about what comes next. I think one of the things that's important is creating hope in communities that there is something next, because when you talk about closing coal plants, there's not a lot of good news going on. We want to create statewide awareness. Having small communities have to kind of battle or try to get resources community by community is very long, hard road. Putting them together, building the political power makes more sense. And we want to connect these communities, obviously, to all the different resources that are possible. Next, please. So we're doing this by providing technical assistance and studies to these communities. We go back and forth with these communities trying to assess what their needs are and then what can the university provide. We also want to be able to identify and develop new industries. There's so much change happening in the electricity industry and others. Are there new industries that can go into these regions to create job and economic development? We want to do education and job retraining, certainly in the wheelhouse of a university. And we also want to serve as an advocate and a connector so that we can help the communities understand what are the regulatory processes, what are the legislative processes to help these communities advocate for themselves. Next. So when we started the center, we thought it made a lot of sense to think about who is our audience, how do we want to work in this space? So we developed a number of guiding principles. We have more than this, but these are kind of the key ones. People come first. People are losing their jobs. They want to stay in their communities. The communities that we're working with are largely Mormon, and they are somewhat Hispanic. These are tight communities. They want to stay where they're based. They've been there a long time. We want to make sure that we have equitable outcomes. So we need everybody at the table. We want to build consensus in the communities as much as possible about where they're trying to go. Obviously, early action is essential. We've had one plant in our state close without much notice. I know that's happened in other places in the country. We believe that transition has to be community-led. And we also know that energy transition is really long-term work. It takes decades to really reform a community. As a land-based organization, a university, we're here for the long haul. So it's another reason why we thought we should pick up this work. Next. So how are we doing our work? We're doing it through planning. We're trying to develop economic glide paths so that we are getting resources into the community so there's not a cliff. We are working, one of our primary work that I'll talk about in just a minute is looking at repurposing existing infrastructure. So Briggs had mentioned transmission. We're thinking about the plant itself. We're also wanting to be mindful of backbone infrastructure issues. There's not great broadband in a lot of these communities, even though the plants might have good broadband, the communities don't necessarily. We're not going to do anything economic development wise unless we have absolutely the best broadband possible. We also want to think about entrepreneurship and new industries, as I mentioned, and creating a shared future for the community. Next. So there are multiple funding sources, as Brig alluded to. When I think about it, I put them into three buckets. There are utility plant owners, there is the state, and there's all the federal resources that are available. The power plant owners, when a number of plants around the country have closed, there have been settlement packages from the utilities to the communities. Arizona had its Public Utility Commission called the Arizona Corporation Commission, went through about a 1.5 year long process to develop policies or guidance to utilities about what they owed communities. Unfortunately, the commission didn't decide anything. And so we're in a situation where the utilities are either providing what resources they want to, or people have to intervene in rate cases. And we have one school district that's intervening in an Arizona Public Service Company rate case right now. But that's hard work. It's expensive, it's time consuming. You don't really know if you're going to get something out of it. So I think Briggs also mentioned this, that there's a number of states that are developing state policy. I think that's very important to be able to guide the closure of our 4 future plants. With the state, we have a budget surplus. We did last year. We expect to have one this coming year. Being able to get allocations either one time or multiple years for communities so they know that they'll be provided with some assistance as the number of dollars going into the community and jobs fall off. We have a new office, the Governor's Office of Resiliency, that actually is our state energy office. We didn't have one for a number of years and it's back and we're very happy about that. And then there's agencies like the Arizona Commerce Authority that works on broadband and job creation. So trying to team with all the state, both for resources, money, but then also technical assistance. The last bucket obviously is federal funding. We're at a point where it's good because there's so much funding available, but there are challenges. These are small communities and going after very large, big new jobs or new employers doesn't sometimes match. I think that we also are in the place where we'd love to bring projects forward to the federal government, to all the different myriad funding sources, but those ideas and projects are still in the generation phase. We haven't gotten to the community place where they really know what they want to go after. And so, we're hoping that the timing ultimately matches up, but we are in a sweet spot of having this funding. If we didn't have this funding, we'd be having a much different conversation with our communities. Next. Next slide.
I'm sorry, something just froze up. Hold on.
Yep. No.
There we go. Sorry.
There we go. Thank you. No worries. No worries. I thought it might be me. So now I want to talk about the biggest project that ASU is working on. We received a significant grant from the EDA to look at repurposing and repowering coal plant sites. Typically, when a coal plant is closed, the historical way to deal with it is you demolish it, you remediate the site, then you think about what comes next. The premise of our grant was to look at using the assets that are in the coal plant because they're quite extensive, and thinking about could those assets be repurposed beyond the transmission to bring in other industries. And so we chose 2 coal plants to work with. They're very different. They're in different counties. One is an investor-owned utility. One is a municipal-owned utility. One's in an incorporated area. One's in a non-incorporated area. And one is closing in 2 years and one's closing in about 10 years. So we're going to walk through these case studies with these utilities and with these communities to try to think about what comes next. I have to mention that the coal plants are owned by the utilities, so it's not up to ASU or the community what happens to them, but we're trying to partner with the utilities to see what can come next. You know, all these facilities were paid for by ratepayers, so, you know, in a way, even though they're privately held, they really are somewhat public assets. So next slide. So the tasks in the grant are, 1, to actually catalog what's in the plants: water, sewer lines, transmission, buildings, roads, water treatment, thinking about all the different components and then what could actually be reused. Some of them are actually not of a quality that could be used, but some of them are. And then task 2 is kind of almost matchmaking, looking at future industries or industries that could expand and create jobs that could utilize some of the assets that are there. And our third task is to continually be talking and working with the community. So we are giving them information, getting information with us so they can steer us in the way that they want us to go. We just started this project the end of last year, so we're kind of nascent in our work, but we've been doing some economic development, or we've been doing some assessment of different opportunities for our first community, which is Cholla, the plant that's going to close in 2 years. So we're starting there, and then we'll move on to the Coronado plant. Next slide. So what's been really fun is to work with the community on what do they think could be possible. It is an industrial plant, so that's some of what the ideas come up. And so the community, this is a list of 8. There's actually, I think we're at like 15 different ideas of different job creators: battery recycling facilities, metal recycling facilities, transload facilities, because there's a railway right by the plant. So we've been, every time we go out to the community, we collect information, we collect new ideas, we bring new ideas. And so it's been this really kind of interesting part with Joseph City to go back and forth on different ideas. We are doing an economic assessment of the major ideas right now to see what actually would produce the most jobs and the most economic revenue for the community. Next. So now, last couple of minutes, I want to talk about some of the lessons learned, and you've heard some of this either through your work, but I think it's kind of worth going through. First is to have a process to guide coal plant closures. We don't have a process in the state of Arizona. I was very glad to hear 8 states now do. I think it creates more emphasis for other people to do it if there's more states that are working this direction. A regulatory guidance to utilities to say you must do this, 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 and this for your communities. Having state level policy that says this is how we're going to treat these communities or these counties. And then thinking about things holistically. So there's obviously the economic cost, but there's huge social costs. There's huge underpinnings in the societal, groups that are out there that aren't going to have funding going forward. So trying to address the problem, not just economically. The second part is thinking that coordinated action is better than individual city by city action. You're going to have better overall outcomes. Economic development may be easier in a region. These regions in our area are very dispersed. They're very small populations. So we're trying to concentrate on plant reuse, but then also how could be distributed economic development be across a region. So trying to think as a full region. And then also trying to increase the political power by having these communities work together. If one town mayor is saying we need help, that's one thing. If 10 are saying we need help, I think the action is probably more likely. The third one is what we found is that the knowledge between the towns that are around a coal plant about the future of the coal plant is very different. And then the knowledge level within the community is very different. We had a situation where the utility was telling us that they had told the community 10 years in advance that the plant was going to close. And yet when we talked to people in the community, people really didn't know that. And so we think that there's an opportunity, and this is where ASU has stepped in, to be a third-party educator, because it's easier for a neutral party to come in and provide information than for the community to get information from the utility sometimes. We also think that, requirements on notification, making sure that utilities have to tell communities when plants are closing and keeping them informed is really important. And then supporting the increasing knowledge in the community. These are small communities with not a lot of people. And so having to build education for them to understand federal opportunities, local opportunities, how other communities have dealt with this problem, we think is important. Next slide. So my last two, the way that ASU likes to look at our job is we are in a support and co-creation mode with these communities. ASU doesn't know what the answer is. The communities don't know what the answer is, but together we can work to try to create a pathway. So we have gone out to communities and done convenings where we talk about what the realities are, timing, what might happen. We've done visioning sessions where we've asked them, what do they think they want to be in the future? What information might they need? We bring that back. We do some research and study. We go back out to the community to try to work with them. We've worked to identify both the elected and the social leaders. Sometimes they're church leaders, sometimes they're the Boy Scout leaders. They can vary, but all of them are important. And then, obviously the co-creation is to link these communities to resources. The last thing I wanted to mention, and maybe this is really obvious for folks, but it was something that I guess I really didn't appreciate, is just how intertwined the plant and the utility is with the community. We've found that many times the community leaders are employees of the plant. And so, or maybe leadership in the community. When someone needs to push on the utility to say, we would like these kinds of services, or we would like you to provide a glide path of money, it's tough if you're employed by that utility to push back on that utility. We've also found that there's a tremendous amount of money that the utilities provide in social services to boys and girls clubs and community foundations, and that when the utility pulls out of the region, all that community funding may go away. And then also thinking about how the identity of the community changes, because certainly when the plant closes, they're no longer a coal plant community. So what do they end up being afterwards? So rapid fire at you, apologize for that. I always speak really quickly. So the center has tried to work to support these rural communities, because in our case, they're all rural. We're thinking long-term and we're thinking people first. We're trying to help communities plan, explore, and evaluate options. We're working on this EDA project to try to test the concept of reusing the physical capabilities that are in the plants. And we continue to learn and co-create with our communities. And it has been very rewarding work. I'll tell you, the people that I work with, it's emotional too, because we see how these individuals struggle. So really is an honor to be working with ASU and trying to support our local communities. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Great to hear about all the work you're doing on the community level. I'll turn things over to Mike to wrap us up.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Skiffington with the Virginia Department of Energy. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process we recently went through that we called Re-Energize Southwest. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit very quickly about the background of my agency and what led us to producing the Re-Energize Southwest report, but I'll spend most of my talk laying out the process and the players and the recommendations that the report ultimately issued. So without further ado, let's go. Up until recently, we were the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, which was formed in 1985 in the Secretariat of Commerce and Trade. And as the result of a recent reorganization within the agency, we are now the Virginia Department of Energy, or our shorthand is Virginia Energy, because I don't think we need another DOE acronym out in the world. There are already plenty of those. We've got 175 offices. Our largest one is in the coal fields in far southwest Virginia in Big Stone Gap. And what we do in a nutshell is regulate all forms of mineral extraction, from reclamation to worker safety to permitting. And we also house the State Geologic Survey, and we also house the State Energy Office where I work. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background. If you find yourself at a brewery trivia one night and this question comes up, you can tell folks that the first commercial coal mining in North America actually happened in Virginia outside the Richmond area in the 1700s. But in modern times, all coal production in the Commonwealth takes place in 7 counties in far southwest Virginia. And as you can see on the slide, over the past 30 years, the coal industry has gradually decreased in its production. 70% of the coal we produce is metallurgical, and most of that is shipped overseas, as opposed to the remaining 30 or so percent, which is used to burn electricity. And speaking of coal, going on to the next slide, there was a report that came out in 2020 from the Joint Legislative and Audit Review Commission, which is basically the watchdog of the legislative branch here in Virginia. They routinely provide oversight to various portions of the state government. And this particular report analyzed tax credits, infrastructure, and regional incentives across all industries in the Commonwealth. And two of the longstanding tax credits they evaluated had to do with the coal industry. One was on the employment side, one was on the production side. And what JLARC found was that those particular tax credits really no longer served their purpose, and they were providing or doing more harm than good, actually. And also they stated that the coalfield region's existing economic development structures needed to be comprehensively evaluated. So the results of that report in September of 2020 can be seen on the next slide. As is often the case, when there's a JLARC report, there's usually legislation that follows. And that was certainly the case here. Legislation was introduced to repeal those tax credits. And during the sausage making process, what came out of that was a work group that my agency was in charge of leading, and those bills did pass the General Assembly and were signed into law. And on the next slide, we can see some of the nuts and bolts that legislation directed us to do. The first bullet there lists the stakeholders that were required to be a part of the work group, and they are folks that you might expect to be there: economic development experts, workforce development experts. But when we started to put our plan together for this, we realized that we wanted to go further than that. We felt we needed to go further than that. So we added our state Department of Housing and Community Development. They do issue a lot of community development block grants and do a lot of work at the local level. So we felt they needed to be involved, and we needed the relevant planning district commissions also to be involved. Those are regional groups who coordinate at the local level to produce better outcomes for those particular regions. And there are 2 of them that comprise the coalfield region in far southwest Virginia. And we invited each of them to have a seat at the table, because obviously having no local presence at the table would not have been a good idea. So we asked them to participate as well. Next slide, please. So this is coming right out of the legislation in terms of what the General Assembly wanted us to focus on. in this report, and you can see that some of these things recall some of the elements from Briggs's presentation: workforce, diversification, reclaiming brownfields and coal impacted lands, clean energy development, and community revitalization and infrastructure improvements. And that's, you know, that's a pretty detailed list when you start peeling back the layers of the onion. Next slide, please. Yeah. So our marching orders didn't really give us a lot of time. The law took effect in July 1st, even though technically we started working long before that because we knew what the calendar was. With us, the first report was due in September, and then we had to turn around and issue a final report in December. As part of public engagement, we had 3 hybrid public meetings across the coalfield region. And that's really important because if you look at a map of Virginia and you see kind of the tiny edge of it that borders West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, you think, oh, that's just, you know, that it must not take very long to get from one end of that part of the state from the other. But due to the topography, that is anything but the case. It can take you about 2 to 2.5 hours to go from the top of the coal fields all the way down to the bottom. So we really wanted to get as many meetings as we could and still have time to put together the report. So we had public meetings, they were streamed. We also set up other ways for folks to get in touch with us so that we can collect the input of the community so they could at least feel like they were heard. Next slide, please. So getting into the recommendations. First of all, support for site development. And this is referring to industrial sites having turnkey ready sites for manufacturers and employers to come in and use. This is not necessarily a coalfield problem. This is a statewide problem for Virginia in that our competing states over the years have devoted a lot more resources than we have, and we're playing catch up now. And it is especially acute in the coalfield region because they have challenges that the rest of the Commonwealth does not. I mentioned topography, that plays a big role. And also not a whole lot of infrastructure out there to support the kind of sites that would develop, that would attract the kind of employer that could help turn the region around. Solar energy, specifically what we're dealing with here is more on the community solar and shared solar level, distributed generation to help lower the cost of energy bills for folks in that region. Energy burdens can be high in that part of the Commonwealth. Higher education, there is plenty of evidence that higher education can serve as sort of small economic engines for small localities. There are a couple of higher education institutions that are doing a good job, but one of the recommendations that came out was, you know, maybe we need to expand some of the program offerings that they offer to attract more younger residents, because one of the many issues facing the coal fields is people are leaving, especially young people. And it's hard to build a tax base and hard to do everything else that you need to do to have a place where people want to live. And other recommendations that you can see there are small downtown revitalization. The Talent Attraction Program essentially is run by Virginia's Tobacco Commission, and it basically says, if you come to live in a distressed area, we'll help you pay off your student loans. And the stakeholder group thought that was an excellent idea and could be expanded to really market it specifically for Southwest Virginia. And other issues that came up are workforce is a huge problem in Southwest. Childcare facilities is a huge problem. Housing is a huge problem. So it's not just a question of what do we do with these jobs or how do we replace these jobs? It's everything associated with it that oftentimes can be just important as the job themselves. And then innovative clean energy pilot programs was also a recommendation, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a second as we move to the next slide. So ongoing efforts, and a lot of these were actually ongoing at the Department of Energy before we got our marching orders to complete the Re-Energize Southwest report. Over the years, we've helped locate over 200 businesses on previously mined land. We have more data than anyone in terms of what's going on top of and underneath the ground in terms of land that's been previously mined. Our abandoned mine land program, which deals with land that was mined before the federal regulatory scheme was passed in 1977, We have done a lot to help water projects in Southwest Virginia. And from a separate pile of money, the AML, Economic Revitalization, or AMLR program that we administer on behalf of the Department of Interior. We've received over $50 million for economic development efforts. Again, that has to have some nexus to land that was mined before 1977. And that can be anything from an industrial park to recreational parks, or anything that runs the gamut that will support economic development on those lands can potentially receive AMLR funds. And more recently, as part of the reorganization that I mentioned earlier, we've created an Office of Innovative Reclamation that is really working with our permittees and the landowners to foster creative approaches for post-mine land use. A lot of times you've got a lot of electrical infrastructure that was there to help support the mine when it was actively mined. So in some instances, that can maybe be a candidate for a renewable energy facility. If you've already got transmission infrastructure close by, that can be something that really would be an innovative use of that land. And more recently, we've been in some very innovative public-private partnerships and pilot projects, such as utilizing mine water to cool data centers, Project Oasis. HVAC costs are one of the highest expenses for data centers, and Southwest Virginia is full of pools of mine water underground that can be used to help support or help reduce those expenses. And we're also using mine land to grow grains for the craft beverage industry, which is very prominent and continues to grow here in Virginia. And a lot of those craft brewers are very interested in using things that are made in Virginia. So that's another area where we're helping to put partnership and put folks together to meet those needs. And as Briggs mentioned, obviously there's a tremendous pot of resources coming down now recently from the federal government that we will be applying for as those things are applicable. So that's just sort of in a nutshell, what Virginia Energy has been doing, not just with the Re-Energized Southwest project, but also with our ongoing economic development efforts to help support that development in Southwest Virginia. So I will leave it there and look forward to answering any of your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mike, Amanda, and Briggs. These were really informative presentations, and I have a couple questions, but I wanted to start with one that came in actually for you, Briggs. Folks are interested in getting a little bit more information on the visualization tool you mentioned, kind of some background on what information on each plant is included, and if there is a plant that has kind of a planned retirement, kind of what information included can states use to prepare for that retirement?
So first of all, folks should go check out the tool. It's at energycommunities.gov, and you can check it out. I think it's on our home page right now, just on a scroller, so you can just click it. The second thing, just off the top of my head, the coal plants that are included in there are a range of those that have already closed relatively recently, as well as some per the EIA database that are planned to close over the next, I don't know what it is, 10 or 15 year window. And so the attributes for those coal plants, if I recall correctly, there's definitely transmission capacity. There's definitely how far is it to the nearest rail infrastructure, water infrastructure. I think there's something about the size of the land, so you can get a sense of the economic development potential. But there's probably 15 or 20 different attributes that would probably be useful for project development. So yeah, check it out and let us know if you'd like to see anything else as well. Like, you know, it's just we just released that in the last couple of months, so we can always think about upgrades.
Yeah, it's a fantastic tool, and we'll include a link when we send the resources around to everyone. Amanda, a question came in. I know you talked a little bit about the importance of broadband access, but some folks were interested if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the importance of broadband for clean energy development. I think you're muted still.
What we found is that a lot of our rural communities, not surprisingly, don't have the best broadband. And so we've been working to make sure that the folks in the state are aware of the challenges. We had a community that didn't have any kind of redundancy in broadband. And so when the broadband went down, the whole region was out. And so when I think about broadband development, it doesn't necessarily support clean energy development as it supports all development. Nobody is going to move to and live in an area, certainly not any young people, unless they have absolutely stellar broadband. So it is necessary for businesses, and it's necessary for clean energy, but it's not just necessary for that. It's really just a fundamental, in my mind, underpinning, almost like water or having housing, right? You have to have connectivity. And there's so much, COVID taught us that people like working remotely. They like to go live in the community they want to live in, and that's completely dependent upon broadband.
Yeah, that's really helpful. It's kind of one of those things that you kind of leave out of the conversation sometimes when thinking about energy and coal transitions, but I think it's super valuable to talk about. And Mike, I don't know if there's any broadband activities you're doing or if you explored any broadband issues in the Re-Energize Southwest report.
We thought about that when we were putting things together, and the State Department of Housing and Community Development that I mentioned earlier is also sort of the lead on broadband for the Commonwealth. And their point of view was, we've got a lot of things in the hopper. We've got a lot of plans we've got a plan for this. We've got this. You guys don't need to focus on that. And we said, okay, great, because we've got enough to focus on as it is. But it is still, in remote parts of the Commonwealth and everywhere, it's still a challenge. But we didn't really spend a lot of our bandwidth on that. No pun intended.
And Kelsey, one of the other things we're encountering is not only broadband, but cost-effective broadband, right? Because you could bring broadband to a community, but if they're losing their jobs or it's not as prosperous, and you get a $60 a month broadband bill, that's not affordable. So it has to be both available and affordable.
And I just wanted to share that given that we heard that broadband and other infrastructure topics were a top priority, we actually have a webinar series that I think this is the first public mention of. So we're breaking news today. We're going to do it in two parts. The first one will be at the end of June, and the second one will be in July. And in the July one, we are going to have NTIA as well as a few other agencies give an update on broadband. So that one will be included. The first one, which will be on June 29th, is already on our website right now, and that one will cover transmission. So we'll have a DOE speaker as well as transportation. So we'll have DOT there. So anyway, look forward to that.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Yeah, I think that'll be super valuable, especially for the NASEO folks to attend, because I think a lot of state energy offices are trying to navigate kind of developing relationships with their broadband office, and with some of this federal funding coming in, seeing if there's any projects or proposals they could partner on. So thank you for that. I wanted to turn to one of my questions just to dive in a little bit into some of those community engagement questions. I think, Mike, you talked about some of the work you did to engage communities in the development of the report. And Amanda, you talked about the community working group that you've been facilitating. I just wondered if all three of you could maybe talk a little bit more about how states can better engage with communities, and if you have any advice on kind of getting communities to the table for these conversations. Maybe Amanda, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. I think one of the things that ASU has been trying to do, and I'm not sure if I had mentioned this, is be really careful with how many times we go to the community, who we go into the community, because there is so much going on, so many projects, so much money flowing. It'd be really easy just to inundate communities with information. And so we try to kind of be the screen. And when we go to the communities, we want to really make sure that we're asking them for their valuable time in good ways. So I think we want to be mindful of that. The other thing is that I think you have to show up. I think you absolutely have to go to the communities, as both Mike and Briggs mentioned, and that's been good. Building that human rapport has been the best thing we know, because these communities also have a lot of people coming at them, telling them things or saying we could build this, we could build that, and so having the community know that we're here, or the state's here, or the feds are here to be able to say, yes, this is legit, or here's some questions you can ask, I think is helpful. So we've found that when we've shown up, it's taken a little while to get the right people to the table, but then once they're engaged, they're enthused. I'll mention one other thing. I mentioned the hope thing at the very beginning. We have tried to bring small project and small successes to the communities that we're working with, and we're not working with very many communities, because we realize that if they can see that there's some projects, there's some hope, there's some study that can be done, then it kind of builds its own energy around it, and people want to do more. It is a tough situation that most of these communities are facing.
Yeah, this is something we could obviously, in and of itself, talk about for hours. The only thing that I'll add is, depending on where you are in Southwest Virginia, you are closer to 6 or 7 other state capitals than you are to Richmond. So it's very important to know what it is you're walking into. Just barging in the door and saying, I'm from Richmond and I'm here to help you, is not going to get you very far. So you have, as Amanda mentioned, you have to take the time to build connections from the ground up, because partly due to the boom and bust history of mining, you're kind of starting from a negative point, because people have heard this before and a lot of things haven't been successful. So you have to be cognizant of that and ready to pitch a tent and do the work, because it's going to take a while to build that trust that you need.
Yeah, Briggs, I'll let you jump in. I just wanted to add, Mike, I know you mentioned some of that, legacy harm to communities, and that there's some pushback because of bad experiences. And Amanda, I know you mentioned, the value of having that third-party facilitator come in who might, have the expertise and knowledge on how to handle those conversations. And I think that's something other states might be interested in looking into. But Briggs, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add about some lessons learned about community outreach or engagement through your work.
I'll just totally agree with what Amanda and Mike said. And that was the stimulus for us to create the rapid response team concept. Because, during COVID, we couldn't be face-to-face with folks. And even when we did bring principals in for big events and get lots of media coverage, that wasn't the goal. The goal was that we wanted to catalyze activity, but without sustaining it on the ground, it just wasn't a good one. You don't want to have a one-time event and then just leave and not come back. And so, the rapid response teams are exactly a response to this realization that you can't mail it in and you have to be on the ground. And so, our field staff are living in these communities and maintaining the relationships, and that's much more effective than folks from Washington just flying in every once in a while.
And I think, having worked in the state energy office, there's a really important component of federal programs through states, which are closer to people, and then into communities who are truly closer to people. So I think that really is super helpful, having the states engaged as somebody who can filter and be able to provide to communities that which is most salient to them, because there's so many programs and so much information right now.
Yeah, agreed. Even from the NASEO perspective, just talking to all the state energy offices every day for them is just a million things coming in from all different directions. But Briggs, I think it would be really great if this isn't already happening, but to connect the rapid response team contacts for the regions with the right state energy office folks. I think it'd be really great for them to know who the right contact is. And if you'd able to send those over to me after this, or
yeah,
send it over to the specific states, I think that would be much appreciated.
Yeah, we're actively looking to engage the various offices of the states that are involved in this work. I mean, economic development obviously comes to mind, but also the state energy offices and others. And so, yeah, would love to make that connection. So thank you for the offer.
Great. Well, it looks like we're coming up on time. So thank you so much, Mike, Amanda, and Briggs, especially for stepping in last minute. This has been a really wonderful webinar, and I think it'll continue to serve as a resource for the states. We'll be sure to share the recording and slides with everyone, even the registrants who weren't able to participate today. But thank you again to the Department of Energy for their support of this effort, and have a great day, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.